Well, good evening. Welcome, everybody. Welcome to our AGA Zoom event, both to our regulars and any new people that are joining us for the first time this week. Welcome to those watching on Facebook, and to anybody listening to the audio replay, which is broadcast every Thursday at midday and Sundays at 4 p.m. on J-Air Jewish Community Radio in Melbourne. That's FM 88. Or j-air.com.au. My name is Alan Friedman. I'm Vice President of the Australian Jewish Association. And also on your screens, you can see David Adler, who's President of the AJA, as well as our guest for tonight, Peter Baum, who we will formally introduce in a moment. This week, we've got a presentation from Peter. It'll go for about 30 minutes, and then we'll take questions from the audience. And if you're new to our sessions, the way to indicate you want to ask a question is to raise your hand electronically. You do that in the reaction icon down at the bottom of the screen. If you like, you can write a question on the chat, and Robert Gregory, our Director of Public Affairs, will read out some of these in between the spoken ones. Now, it's a saying that has been attributed to Nazi Germany, but it is said that if you tell a lie big enough and keep repeating it, people will eventually come to believe it. Without doubt, one of the most troubling aspects of Israel advocacy is the invented history of an ancient Indigenous Palestinian Arab population that succumbed to the Jewish colonial enterprise with the establishment of the modern state of Israel in 1948. How is this false narrative best challenged? How can the media be persuaded to tell the truth? Or is, in fact, this battle lost? Peter Baum is a UK-based former international bank auditor with experience in Arab and Muslim countries, and he is an incisive commentator on Israel and Middle Eastern politics. He's on the Jewish Board of Deputies, and he's active in Friends of Israel groups. Peter is also Foreign Affairs Editor for online magazine WeeklyBlitz, and his articles appear in a range of publications. Peter, welcome to the AJA audience here in Australia, and thank you for your time.
My pleasure.
Now, Peter, I think you're going to start with the presentation, so if you want to screen share and take it away when you're ready.
I'm ready, gents, so I'll begin if that's okay with you guys. Okay. First of all, it's a pleasure and a privilege to be addressing you today. And just a couple of acknowledgements, if I may, to Elaine Black, who has been unbelievably supportive of circulating my output, and your good old friend Hugh Kitson, who I know is just back from Oz in Australia. So hi to you guys. And I've got to say hi to my kids and grandkids who hopefully are tuning in from Perth in Western Australia. So today's presentation is going to be about challenging the false narrative. And for the last 6 or 7 decades, we know how that's gone regarding the Israel Palestinian issue, that Israel is a colonial power. She legally occupies Indigenous Palestinian land, that she's an apartheid and racist state, and she treats her Palestinian citizens like second-class citizens, etc., etc., etc. We've all been through this. We know how it goes from mainstream media. Now, you're going to hear some things today which many of you will already know, but I hope a lot of you will say, hey, I really didn't know that. And it's about challenging the false narrative that has grown up over the last 6 or 7 decades. And why is it important to challenge the false narrative? Because we know as Jews living outside of Israel that anything to do with the Israel-Palestinian issue, when it blows up, Jews are affected personally. Our safety is affected, our kids' safety is affected, anti-Semitism grows at an alarming rate. So today's discussion, which is broken down into 3 sections, is to put to bed some of the mythology that has unfortunately morphed into facts, and to give everyone here the confidence and perhaps a bit more knowledge about how going forward we can debunk some of the myths that have arisen. So the first section is the legal aspect, because we're told time and time again that Israel is an illegal occupier of Palestinian land. Now, the international law is clear and unambiguous when it comes to defining the legal borders and geographical landmass of Israel. And I assure every one of you listening here today that that landmass under international law includes what is now called the West Bank, but we know as Judea and Samaria, and believe it or not, Gaza. And the geography was first defined after World War I with the breakup of the Ottoman Empire, when the League of Nations voted unanimously, 51 out of 52. Turkey did not vote because she did not want to vote for her own breakup, when only a simple majority was needed. And that League of Nations mandates not only was of the mandate for Palestine, but also for Syria, for Lebanon, for Mesopotamia, which is now called Iraq, for Palestine, which is now called Israel. And I assure you that in that mandate for Palestine, dated 1922, the West Bank and Gaza were included in the geographical defined areas of what is now known as the Jewish state of Israel. When the League of Nations ceased to exist and morphed into the United Nations in 1945, the United Nations, through its charter, was legally obliged to endorse, ratify, confirm, validate everything that the League of Nations had previously passed, including the mandates. And she did so in various articles, specifically Article 80 of the UN Charter. And added to this are two very important legal principles of international law. One is called acquired rights and the other is called estoppel. And basically acquired rights means that any nation that has received rights via a UN mandate or treaty, as those countries did after the Ottoman Empire was broken up, those rights could never be taken away from that country. And the reverse of that is called estoppel, which means any country that originally had voted for those rights, those 51 countries out of the 52 that I referred to, could never say, hey guys, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to vote the way I did. I'm taking that vote away. So the defined borders of Israel, originally established in the Mandate for Palestine of 1922, coming through to the United Nations Charter of 1945, and more recently upheld in international law, and this is going to surprise you, is the most recent court case that upheld that international law, which I've just been referring to, was in the second chamber of the Court of Versailles in 2013, where the Palestinian Authority took the state of Israel and the city of Jerusalem and a couple of French construction companies to court, saying that this is Palestinian territory, you can't build a railroad through that geographical area. And the court threw it out and said, no, international law is firm on this. Judea and Samaria, or the West Bank, and indeed Gaza, fall within Israel's international legal boundaries. Now, I have no idea why the government of Israel and other pro-Israeli commentators globally never use this argument when challenging the pro-Palestinian mob. One of the comebacks that the anti-Jewish state mob have when it comes to international law is this. They say, yeah, but Israel breaches various, what's the word I'm looking for? Various UN resolutions, such as Resolution 181, Resolution 242, etc., etc., etc. Let me assure everyone here today that a country can accept, reject, implement, or ignore a UN resolution. A UN resolution does not form the basis of international law. And everything that I've referred to, the League of Nations mandate, the UN Charter of 1945, and thereafter the latest ruling, court ruling, which upheld those laws, the Court of Versailles ruling in 2013, is everything you need to know about Israel's rights to the geographical borders, which I've just described. One of the other comments that is made is that Israel is in breach of the 4th Geneva Convention of Human Rights by forcibly moving one population to another. Again, the Court of Versailles ruling was quite clear on this. Israel does no such thing. And even if she did, the League of Nations mandate and the UN Charter would simply overrule the 4th the Geneva Convention of Human Rights. So that is the legal argument that I use against the anti-Israel brigade, whether it's in the press or in debates, etc., etc. And I can assure you, when I use those arguments and have the competencies to counter those about the UN resolutions, it shuts up the opposition. They do not have an answer, and I have yet to meet or yet to be in debate with any international lawyer. And I'm not an international lawyer, believe me. I just leverage up from what I've read from other commentators, and no one has been able to refute those arguments. So in 10 minutes here, we've put forward the reasons why Israel is not in breach of international law. And in fact, the geographical area of the Jewish state of Israel actually includes the West Bank, Judea and Samaria, and indeed Gaza. So having put that to bed, I'm now going to move on, if I may, to the religious claims on the Jewish state of Israel, as put forward by the pro-Palestinian brigade. Now, there's absolutely no need for me here today to describe or recount to you the Jewish connection of Jerusalem and the Holy Land, the Jewish state of Israel. But we can challenge the Islamic claims, and this is going to surprise many of you, but it's not me just saying this. We can revert to numerous Islamic commentators, scholars, imams, heads of state that completely support this claim. In the Quran, neither Jerusalem nor Palestine, the term Palestinians are ever mentioned in the Quran. So it seems a paradox that the Palestinians should make such hay out of the religious connection that the Palestinians have to Jerusalem. In fact, Muslims turn their back on Jerusalem when they pray, which is a sign of disrespect. But more importantly than that, I can point to numerous paragraphs within the Quran known as surahs, S-U-R-A-S, not surahs, but surahs, which actually are clear and unambiguous that Jerusalem is bestowed, bequeathed, and promised via Allah through the Prophet Muhammad to the Jewish people. There are numerous surahs. The most important are probably 17,100 and 521, but there are at least 30 to 40 others which confirm exactly what I'm saying. Now, when I put this, and also, may I say to you, that there are various imams who you can easily find if you Google Sheikh Palazzi, who's head of the Muslim community in Italy, for example, would confirm exactly what I'm saying, that as Jerusalem is holy to Jews, it is not holy to Muslims. And one of the arguments I use, and is being used more and more again, that support for the Palestinian Islamic claims to Jerusalem is actually Islamophobic, because it mocks and defies the word of Allah and Muhammad. There is this myth that has been, that the Muslims like to use about Muhammad visiting the farthest mosque, which they suggest is in Jerusalem. That is not the case. The farthest mosque was always supposed to be in Mecca. During his lifetime, Muhammad never visited Jerusalem, let alone the farthest mosque. He died in 636, and the mosque in Jerusalem, commonly called the Aqsa Mosque now, wasn't constructed until about 720. So the scholars understand that the furthest mosque, which Muslims like to say is the Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem, is in fact no such. That is not the mosque, it's the one in either Mecca or Medina. So we have a number of paragraphs within the Quran absolutely backing what I've just said, supporting what I've just said, that the Holy Land, the land of milk and honey, is bestowed, promised and bequeathed to the children of Israel, the Jewish people. Now, many of the comebacks that I have to face is, but hold on a minute, the Quran is very, very negative to the Jews. And it is, it calls for death to the Jews, that they should be hung, they should be thrown in wells, etc., etc., etc. That is absolutely true. So how does one balance that, that paradox? On the one hand, the Quran promises all the area to the Jewish people, on the other hand, calls for the death of the Jews. And that's something that troubled me until I spoke to a number of Islamic scholars, and the answer is really quite simple. Up until the 11th century, the term Jews was not the collective term used for the Jewish people. It was the term used only for how the world perceived the followers of Christ, or the militants. Christ was always known as King of the Jews. He was never known as King of the children of the house of Israel, or the children of Israel, because the term Jews was simply a negative collective term used for those Jews who were let's say the left-wing Trotskyists, the militants of the day. The house of Israel, or the Jewish people, or the chosen people was the collectives used for the Jewish people, and not Jews. So arguing against those who even today suggest that the Quran wants to kill all those of the Jewish faith is absolutely untrue. And again, I can point to numerous surahs within the Quran, which I argue is a Zionist document, because it bequeaths, promises and bestows that whole geographical area to the Jewish people. And again, I assure you, when I use those arguments in the many debates that I have with those anti-Israel mob who use the religious argument to support the Palestinian claims, nothing is furthest from the truth. And there are many scholars today that are suggesting that one of the reasons that the world of Islam is in such turmoil, whether it's Yemen, Syria, Iraq, North African countries such as Libya, one of the reasons it's in such turmoil is because of the support the world of Islam has given to the false Palestinian claims over Jerusalem. Do you know, when Jordan was in control of Jerusalem between 1948 and 1967, not one Muslim head of state visited the city that was so holy to them. In fact, even Jordan stopped putting out the Friday night prayers from the mosque in Jerusalem to mosque in Amman, and the only office they kept open, administrative office, the religious offices were all moved to Amman. The only office they kept open was the Jordanian Tourist Board in Jerusalem. I assure you, Jerusalem, from a religious point of view, is not important to Muslims. It's only important from a political point of view when the world of Islam does not have control of it. I was going to say something else following that, but I've forgotten. So I'm going to move on to the next subject, which is challenging. So we've challenged the legal, or we've tried to expose and challenge the legal narrative and why that's false. We've looked at the religious claims and why that's false. And now we're going to look at something that's a little bit more complex, and that's the political and historical claims, because this is where they morph into one another. And this is where I probably have the most difficulty, although I've come up with some ideas recently that seem to be working. Now, forgive me, I'm going to make two very silly jokes here, but they're important because they will give this audience an idea of what the Palestinians are all about. And I've seen this on social media many times, and it goes like this. Joke number one, the Palestinians are the only group to fear archaeology. And number two, like silicone breast implants and the miniskirt, the Palestinians were invented in the 1960s. And when you come to look at those two rather crass statements, they do prove a point. They're absolutely true. In other words, up until 1964, there was no such race, tribe, people, nation, or culture known as the Palestinians. And what I do to stump the opposition, how I argue it, is every few months I come out with a quiz and I ask the following questions. If there were an indigenous nation, tribe, people, or culture known as the Palestinians, then historically, what war or battle was ever fought by this group against any foreign or domestic invader? And what was the name of the person who led the Palestinians during that time? I ask, what was the name of the Palestinian currency since time immemorial? Or name any structure, either standing or destroyed, that the indigenous Palestinians built in their indigenous homeland. What was a Palestinian emblem? And the coup de grace is, what did the Palestinians call themselves in their mother tongue? Now, we know from the modern day Palestinians that their education system, their charter, their newspapers are currently in Arabic. That we all agree on. But in Arabic, there is no sound for the letter P for Palestinian. That's a fact. You won't find an Arabic name, town, or center, or with the letter P doesn't exist. Arabs pronounce the letter P either with an F or with a B. So when I say to the anti-Israel mob, well, what was the original mother tongue of the Palestinians and what they call themselves? They answer, this is easy. It's Arabic, and we call ourselves Philistines or Philistinian. So I go, that's interesting, because Philistinian is the Arabic pronunciation for Philistine. Now, the Philistines came from Greece. They were seafaring invaders. They became extinct in about 500 CE, and they certainly didn't speak Arabic. And the modern day translation of Philistine is uncouth, uncultured heathen. Why would today's Palestinians call themselves after extinct Greek invaders or uncouth heathens? And again, this stumps them. They don't have an answer for it because, ladies and gentlemen, there is no answer for it. The Palestinians were a political invention of the 1960s. And it's not just me saying this. The sources that I go to are the various statements made by even those leaders who founded the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, in the 1960s. Zuhair Mushin, PLO military commander in I think it was 1977, gave an interview for a Dutch newspaper called Der Trover, and he stated something along these lines. The quote is there on Google for those who care enough. The term Palestinian is a new invention. We use it simply as a tactic against the Israelis in order to defeat the Jews and drive them out of Jerusalem. The Arab leader to the Peel Commission in 1937 even stated to the Peel Commission that the Palestine and Palestinians are a term invented by the Zionists. There is no such thing in our Quran as Palestine or the Palestinians. And we can point to numerous sayings by Arab leaders dismissing the very idea of the existence of a Palestinian people, race, nation, or tribe. Now, in my research, I have actually reviewed, along with others, at least 30 books, documents written by those itinerant scribes who traveled to the geographical area from the 8th century through to the early 20th century, and not one of them, whether it's Thackeray, Sebald Rita, the fantastically named Count de Chateaubriand, Volney, Flaubert, I can name at least 25 others, I won't bore you with them. In all their writings, not one of them ever mentions a group described as the Palestinians who were indigenous to the land and were fighting for their indigenous rights against any invaders. They simply did not exist. And again, I implore you that if you look through history, that there's even a very famous map that I put out in one of my articles, which was just created after the Sykes-Picot Agreement at the end of during the First World War, that listed all the indigenous groups to the area. And I swear to you, out of those 20 indigenous groups, the Palestinians are not mentioned. There are Circassians, there are Persians, there are Assyrians, Jewish people, but Palestinians are never ever mentioned. Actually, if I may, I did forget one thing when I was talking about the religious aspect. If I may revert back to that just for a second, because it's very, very important. We were talking about how the Palestinians claim that Islam is so holy to Jerusalem. In some of my articles, I've actually quoted some 11th, 12th and 13th century Islamic scholars who were very pragmatic about this. They could foresee the time when Arab Muslim greed for land would create the environment where militant leaders would create hadiths or Quranic verses that would overshadow the origins of the Quran, the original writings of the Quran. And they suggested that any hadith that ever gave Jerusalem a place in Islamic culture or history and religion was the equivalent of disobeying Allah and the Quran and should be punishable by death. That's a very important point, and I always use that when I argue with the more knowledgeable anti-Israel mob. So I had to get that in, and now I'm going to revert back to the politics of it all. So in all these writings of people throughout history, not one of them has ever come up with the notion of a Palestinian tribe, race, people, or culture, because they didn't exist. The Palestinian cause was created as a direct result of the loss of Jerusalem in it really started to gather momentum after the loss of Jerusalem in 1967, but it was actually a creation of an Egyptian Arafat backed by the KGB and various other Eastern European countries who decided they needed a proxy to fight the America and Israel and her allies in the 60s. It's interesting also, if we look back in history, to see, because one of the other things that the Palestinian mob accuse Israel of is stealing their land. I've told you the legal aspect. When it comes to stealing land, this is interesting as well. In the 1937 British Peel Commission, when Great Britain was in charge of the area, the Grand Mufti, believe me, no friends of the Jewish people, admitted under oath to Sir Laurie Hammond that no land had been stolen. In fact, every dunam, or acre as it was called, had been purchased either by individual Jewish philanthropists or by the Jewish National Fund. And in fact, when Israel was created in 1948, the last survey was done by the British Palestine Survey in what was then Palestine, about land ownership, and it went something like this. 72% of the total land area was what was called state lands and wastelands. That is, under no private ownership whatsoever, but up to the administering power, in this case Great Britain, to give to the Jewish people under the League of Nations Mandate Treaty. About 8% was actually Jewish owned, so purchased within the late 19th, earliest 20th century by such organisations as the Zionist Federation and the Jewish National Fund. So that brings it up to 78%. About 8% was owned by Arab families. And usually these were by the Arab militias who actually kicked off what they called the fellahin, or the peasant farmers, and just threw them off the land. The actual title deeds, there was no such thing as title deeds until about 1888, when the Turks started putting in a system of administration. So that would bring it up to about 88%, and about 12% of the land, no one knew who owned it because there was no claim on it whatsoever. It possibly could have been owned by Arab families. It could have been owned by, I tell you like, 8%, about 7%, forgive me, 72% state lands and wastelands, 8% Jewish owned, so that's 80%, 8% Arab owned, 5% owned by such organisations as the Greek Orthodox Church and the Christian Brothers and religious groups, and the remainder no one knows. So when people say the Jews stole the land from the Arabs, that's a complete nonsense as well. And let's not also forget that the 5 Arab nations attacked the fledgling state of Israel in 1948, and of course some Arabs were forced to leave, mainly on the orders of the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, who said he would consider those Arabs as being traitors if they stayed and helped the Jews, as has been written in various diaries from the administrators, who actually state that the Jewish leadership pleaded with the Arab population to stay. I've gone through about as much then as is necessary, and I'd be happy to take any questions from you guys if I mean, I could go on forever and ever about this, but there has to be some kind of stop. So
Yeah.
I've covered the legal, religious, and political, semi-political aspects, but I hope that's sufficient for the purposes of this talk.
Yep, thank you, Peter. Now we'll just take a little break so you can have your coffee. If you're listening on J-Air, this is the Australian Jewish Association Zoom event, which we have every Wednesday night. Our guest tonight is Peter Baum in the UK, and we are discussing how to challenge the false Palestinian narrative that is so pervasive. Just before we go to questions, I'll hand back to David for a moment. He can tell us what's coming up, and then we'll open up the floor.
Okay, thank you very much, Alan. Two things I'd like to show briefly. Firstly, as we always do, if there's anybody here who is not yet providing support to AJA, it's really important you do so. Go to the website jewishassociation.org.au, join as a member, make a donation. You can also subscribe to the email list so that you receive our notifications. And next Wednesday is Purim, so we are not holding a Zoom event next week. So I'll just foreshadow that the week after that, we have a special guest, Josh Haston, who's the international spokesman for Gush Etzion, and we will be talking about the challenges of Jewish communities in Judea Samaria. Now, one last thing to show very briefly, which I think reinforces one of the points that Peter was making, and we need to be familiar with this. This is a very useful document. It's the guide by the Supreme Muslim Council. He referred to the tourist office that remained open, well, even prior to the state of Israel, the modern state of Israel. They were conducting tours of Al-Harim al-Sharif, which is the Arab term for the Temple Mount. And there's this very important phrase in it. I'll just read it, that it is beyond dispute that this too is the spot, according to universal belief, on which David built there an altar to the Lord and offered burnt offerings and peace offerings. In other words, we have the Supreme Muslim Council of the time acknowledging that the site of the Temple Mount is indeed the site of the Jewish Temple Mount. So that's my contribution to the particular discussion. And Alan, let's invite questions.
Okay, just before we do that, David, I just wanted to ask Peter quickly one or two. Peter, what you've outlined is very thorough and very accurate. It's all true. And yet we still seem to face this problem, don't we? I just want to ask you, do you actually feel that you make any progress by explaining the true situation, or are you finding that there are just blocks everywhere you turn?
Very interesting question. On mainstream media, for reasons that are beyond me, I haven't seen anyone who espouses the kind of narrative that I've just exposed here today. Not even when they interview members of the various Israeli embassies worldwide. They just don't seem to use that narrative. I have no idea why. On social media, which I hate, so on mainstream media, I don't have any chance. People like us don't get their voice heard on mainstream media. Maybe occasionally you might find someone. I noticed recently Hugh Kitson was on Australian television, and Richard Camp occasionally comes on and is introduced and speaks about the subject. But on social media, which is where the next generation get their news from, I at least have a chance. People like us have a good chance because we can get our message across. And as long as we keep circulating and redistributing that narrative, eventually we will have at least a 50-50, well, if not a 50-50 chance, a much better chance of getting the narrative across than we've ever had on mainstream media. But unfortunately, on mainstream media, for people of my generation, perhaps a little bit younger and a little bit older, the damage has already been done. The BBC have been shocking in the way they portray the Israeli-Palestinian issue, to the point of being just outrageously, rabidly anti-Jewish state. And I have no idea why people did not challenge. I mean, there were some very brave people that put their head above the parapet in the 60s, in the 70s and the 80s and going forward, but certainly not enough. But I'm astounded as to why the Israeli leadership, irrespective of the makeup of the government, never had anyone to eloquently and attractively portray the narrative as it is. It's astounding to me. Israel are great at many things, but believe me, public relations is not one of their strengths.
No, and that leads me to one other supplementary question. The words that we hear a lot, occupation and settlements. Have we inadvertently helped the Palestinian cause by repeatedly using their terminology?
Almost certainly, because it's not the case. I mean, the settlements and the as we all know, the various areas of the West Bank are split into zones, like areas A, B, and C, etc. And this is a political compromise. There's no doubt about that. But I still believe that we should be reverting to the narrative, the established legal narrative, which is, as is international law. There's no doubt about it. So terminology is very, very important. I've seen some questions here about the accusations of Israel being an apartheid state and a racist state. Anyone who cares to look at the English translations of the Hamas and Palestinian Authority charters would no doubt be aware that those are two of the most racist documents. They actually puppet Nazi ideology. And this is another tool that I use in my arguments. I noticed that quite a few questions coming up about Israel being a racist state and apartheid state. The actual charters, the 1968 Palestinian National Council Charter and the 1998 Hamas Palestinian Charter, if you go through and read the English translations, you would be shocked at how they mimic Nazi ideology. Basically, Jews, Israel, the state of Israel is to be eliminated, Jews to be exterminated, Islam is to be all other religions and races must be subservient to Islam or face death. The Hamas Charter goes even further. I kid you not. It actually suggests in Articles 17, 22 and 28 of that charter that anyone who is working for voluntary organisations, certain charitable organisations, or assisting to raise funds for charitable organisations, assisting, for example, terminally ill children or those suffering from cancer or dementia, will be exterminated. I kid you not. I've belonged to one of those organisations. It's a Freemasons lodge. I've been a member for 35 years. And all we've done since I've been a member is raise money for good causes. And it's not a Jewish lodge, it's a multi-religious lodge. And that's all we do. And people who belong to that lodge, according to the Palestinian Hamas Charter, are to be exterminated. That's another very powerful tool that I have we have in our armory to counter the claims that, hey, it's not Israel and the Jewish people who are racist, it's actually the Palestinians as per their charters, which is still valid.
Okay, thanks, Peter. Now I've got Hugh, Robin, Jeff, Leah, Trebish and Eitan. So Hugh, we'll take you first, so please unmute yourself. And it's nice to see you safe and sound back home.
Thanks very much, Alan. It was good to have a coffee with you again last week in Melbourne. Peter, my question actually relates to the British government. I mean, we both know that the British government actually violated the terms of the mandate on almost every single level. And not only that, but actually led the invasion, certainly by Jordan, militarily led an illegal invasion of Arab nations, as illegal, by the way, as the Russian invasion of Ukraine today. To what extent do you believe that the mess that we have today, the misinformation we have today, is a legacy of the British mandate and the way that Britain behaved?
You know, Hugh, I knew I'd get this question from you, and you're absolutely bloody right. And one thing that I purposely did not speak about, because I thought it would just overcomplicate this. Everyone has listened to what I suggested was the defined legal boundaries and geographical area of the Jewish state of Israel. I'm going to throw a spanner into the works, which has been created by Hugh's question, in that Great Britain did renege on the terms of the mandate, and this has never been tested, but would be very interested to see if it was. Great Britain unilaterally implemented an Article 25, I think it was, into the original League of Nations mandate, when they should have received majority approval to implement, or to put in that extra article. And basically that extra article cut off over 70% of what was originally designated for the landmass of the Jewish state of Israel, or Palestine as it was then called, and gave it to the Jordanians, who they were backing in a war against Saudi, I believe. So Great Britain has a lot to answer for in terms of where we are today, and at certain times during the history of Great Britain, especially after the war with the Labour government of Bevin, they sold Israel and the Jewish people down the river, and it's more than a miracle to where we are today. Is quite unbelievable when we see what's going on with the Abraham Accords, with the Arab countries normalizing relationships with Israel, to the frustration and annoyance of the Palestinians. This is also a remarkable turn. Yes, but to answer Hugh's question, it was Britain's duplicity that leaves us with the situation that we are today. There is no doubt about that.
Yeah, thanks, Peter. Reuven and Jeff will come to you in a moment, but we'll take Eitan, so please unmute yourself, Eitan, and ask your question. You're still muted. That's it.
Right, my name is Eitan. I was born in Israel. I'm 85 years of age. When I went to school, from the Jordan till the sea, this was the West Bank. The other part was called Transjordan. That's where I learned. Now, when the Jewish people arrived, look, it won't be a question, be just a little speech. When the Jewish people started to arrive to Palestine in 1882, most of Israel was empty. And as soon as the Jewish people come and created work, the Arabs started to arrive. Now in Arabic, you cannot mention the land P, so they don't say Palestine, they say Palestine with a B. What else can I tell you?
Eitan, if there's no question, we're happy to have that.
No, that's basically one more thing. The Aqsa Mosque is built of a remain of a church. Was a church there, and then they demolished the church. One more thing. Aqsa, it means Katzeh in Hebrew, which means the other side. And Aqsa is not in Israel. Is in Saudi Arabia. Is Aqsa. That's all.
Yeah. Thank you, Eitan. Reuven, please unmute yourself and ask your question.
Peter, hi. The international law, it appears to be undermining Torah law. Torah is international law. And our justification for our right to be Eretz Israel, what is the definition of Israel, is what's in the Torah. You know, you mentioned the Judea, Samaria, Gaza. You didn't mention Jordan. You have said that, okay, it was illegally taken into national law, but in the Torah law, it's very clear. Now, what about Sinai? We gave back Sinai. We don't have issues with Hamas in Gaza when we had the Sinai. Can you clarify? Wouldn't you say that Sinai should be now in international law? Either we were forced to give it back and Carter put Begin's arm behind his back, so to speak.
Sorry, Robin, I'm not quite sure what you mean, but
Robert's asking about Sinai. You've mentioned Judea, Samaria, and Gaza.
Yeah.
Does Sinai factor into any of what would constitute Eretz Israel and perhaps thereby the modern state of Israel? Because we ended up giving Sinai back to the Egyptians.
That's absolutely true. And politically, I would suggest, and even legally, it would not be in Israel's interest to make any claim on that area. Where we are at the moment, we have since Sadat came to power, cordial, but certainly now warming relations with Egypt. You must have seen recently how the Egyptian president went and greeted the Israeli Minister for Energy at a conference. And that was a sign to me how far Israel-Egypt relations have grown. And don't forget, both countries now have a common enemy in, let's call it Islamic fundamentalism and the role of Iran. So from a purely Jewish religious point of view, I don't know the answer to that. From a legal and political point of view, I'm totally convinced that it is in Israel's best interest to keep things the status quo as they are at the moment.
Okay, thank you. Jeff, please unmute yourself.
Shalom, Peter. Shalom, Peter. You and Alan were talking about the importance of terminologies, and indeed, I would suggest to you one of the greatest pieces of anomalies is the unilateral withdrawal from Gaza, as if you can have a bilateral withdrawal from Gaza, and our enemies used the terminology unilateral withdrawal from Gaza as a means of bashing Israel for something that is so absurd. The terminology is so absurd. But yet I have never seen anybody anywhere debunk it for what it is, a complete sham.
You're right. Israel thought that by relinquishing control of Gaza, she would get peace. What she got was rockets and missiles and anything but. And I hope that one day, with probably the assistance of Egypt, or maybe from internal dissension, that the current ruling parties over Gaza will no longer be in existence. I don't know the answer to that, but certainly Gaza politically seems like it was a mistake to withdraw from, but Israel thought she would get peace, and she didn't, unfortunately. She got quite the reverse.
Yes. Moish, please unmute yourself and ask your question.
Thank you. Disturbed by the difficulty of you getting traction in what it is that you're trying to point out, and you pointed out with the Israeli government not using the sort of material that's available to you. To what extent are you in contact and reaching out to people who are opinion makers, as it were, here in Israel? You can see a fair bit of right-wing type writers in the Jerusalem Post, for example. Do you at least try to negotiate, to speak to, let's say, even in the academia, and let's say even left-wing academics? Would they at least acknowledge what you say, but say, look, politically we can't do it, but we hear what you're saying?
You know, one of the biggest problems that someone like myself has, and others like me, is that the opposition from, let's say, Jewish left-wing groups is quite staggering. At every opportunity, they will criticize the actions of Israel and never be supportive of their actions. And people who are on the pro-Palestinian side, who aren't Jewish, point out to those groups and saying, hey, they're Jews, and look, even they think that Israel is behaving atrociously. So I have funnily enough, on Monday night, I was in touch with somebody who has very close contacts to the Israeli foreign minister, and I put this case to him, and he said he will try his utmost to get me either a meeting, not necessarily with the foreign minister, but with someone who works for him, just to put this view across and to understand why Israel is not making and has never made the same kind of arguments that we're discussing here today. It's staggering to me. One of the reasons I did get was that actually Israel doesn't care, but she must care. And if she doesn't care, she should care, because it's people like us in the diaspora who are suffering the consequences, because the anti-Israel mob need no excuses to commit acts of anti-Semitism when Israel behaves in a certain way.
Yeah. Now, Robert Gregory is our Director of Public Affairs. Robert, have you got any written questions that you want to ask?
Yeah, we've got a few questions. So one we had was, what opportunities are there to engage with the other side when they keep being in their own echo chamber and they're avoiding being challenged in open public forums?
Okay, the best way forward on this, amazingly enough, is I think because of the initiatives put forward by Donald Trump, not everyone's favourite, I realise that, but the Abraham Accords have been quite remarkable. We've seen normalisation relations with a number of Arab countries now, the UAE, Morocco, trade deals, etc., etc., etc. And I hope that we're going to see more of that. And I believe that that is the best way, not only to silence the opposition, but to engage with those who previously have held Israel as an enemy. So just to give you an example, in Saudi at the moment, you might have read in the press that Saudi are engaging with Israel, but they're not going to recognize Israel yet until the Palestinian issue is sorted. The Saudi education authorities are going through a process at the moment, whereas up until a few months ago, they were totally negative and hostile towards the Jewish state of Israel. They are currently easing that narrative, as the UAE have already done, as Morocco are doing, because they have created the conditions over the last 30 years where everyone growing up in those countries has been inundated that Israel, a terrible country, the Jews are awful, etc., etc., etc. So it takes a while to soften that narrative, and people will be seeing that. And I think in the months and years ahead, provided that momentum is maintained, then I think that will be the best way to engage with the opposition. People who hate Israel are always going to hate Israel for some reason. I've no idea why.
Yeah, thanks, Peter. Look, I'll just take the final question just to finish off with. And I wanted to ask you about the two-state solution, which is the immovable default position for so many communal organisations, certainly in this country. Now, there are several alternatives that have been presented over the years. Do you think we should be doing more to maybe not promote them, but at least bring them out for discussion?
Yeah, the Board of Deputies of British Jews, which I represent for my local community, is adamant about the two-state solution. Look, the whatever political initiatives are created, it's to be via Israel and her neighbours. I would hope that, listen, even the Israelis don't care if the Palestinians have a state or not, but they just want peace. And according to the Palestinian charters, that is so off the scale at the moment, and we see, and Israelis see that and witness that every day in their lives. The Palestinian youth have been inundated with propaganda to hate and to kill Jews, and from the river to the sea, we see all that. That narrative has got to change, and until that narrative changes, they can talk about the two-state solution until time immemorial. It's not going to happen, but at this stage, I think we've got other things to work on, and that would be low down my list of priorities as a pro-Israeli activist into bringing that forward, let's say.
Okay. All right. Look, we have come up to time, so I want to thank you, Peter, for joining us. You're a powerful voice of reason and common sense, and you've provided us with some interesting tips on dealing with all this. But as you say, I think this battle is not going to go away anytime soon. So I want to thank you for joining us, and you're welcome anytime in Australia. Just before we go, there is a link up on the chat. Just tell us which is the best way to see any of your writings.
I would really appreciate it if you log on to Facebook, see some of the stuff I've written and circulate it. One thing that is going to amaze you guys as well, as you mentioned before, I'm foreign editor of an online publication called WeeklyBlitz. What you don't know is that WeeklyBlitz is an Islamic publication. It's the biggest circulated Islamic English journal in South Asia. And the publisher tells me that he can charge more for advertising on my op-eds than any other writer. So, and apparently the Prime Minister of Bangladesh, when she read my article about how the Quran was a Zionist document, got her Minister for Religious Affairs to look into it, and he contacted me, and we went through a discussion, but she can't make that public to her population quite yet. So word does get out. I would love you guys to either follow me on Facebook, and if there's an article that catches your attention, just circulate it to your contact base, and let's get the word out there.
Okay, terrific. Peter, thank you so much. It's been wonderful speaking with you, and all power to you in your future endeavours. Thank you very much, Peter Baum.
Thank you very much.
Just before we go, the L'Chaim program with Morris Klein is just starting now on Radio 3ZZZ. You can find that on FM 92.3 in Melbourne or 3ZZZ.com.au. Morris is actually interviewing the new Israeli ambassador to Australia. So you can jump over now and have a listen. That's all we have for tonight. Next week is Purim, of course, so there's no session. But the following week, we have Josh Haston to tell us about the challenges of living in Judea and Samaria. Don't forget to keep up to date with what the AJA is talking about. As Peter mentioned, Facebook is a good place to do it. Please like our page and share it widely. But for now, we wish you all a very good evening and look forward to seeing you again in 2 weeks' time. From me, it's goodbye to you all. Bye for now.